Hello, friends. Welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast. We are continuing our crash course series through the entire canon of Scripture. And today we will be talking about 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Jeremy, it's good to have you join this coffee hour to discuss a book that often gets neglected because people read 1st Kings, 2nd Kings, 1st Samuel, 2nd Samuel, and they get to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and they're like, I felt like I just read this. I'm going to skip over to the Gospels or something. So what's First Chronicles and Second Chronicles, and why do you think the church has kept it in the canon? The Hebrews have kept it in their scripture canon as well.
Well, they have just read it because it's all pretty much the same stories in First and Second Chronicles as you get in First and Second Kings, and like you said, back to First and Second Samuel even. Yeah, it's also not a terribly exciting book to get started. It's not a page turner from the beginning.
Yeah.
The start of the book is just a long list of people who begat other people and a long genealogy of families and who's related to who. So yeah, it's a tough book to get through. It's kind of like if you didn't stop reading in Leviticus, then you might just end up stopping in Chronicles.
Yeah. I think Leviticus and Chronicles are like the killers for people who want to read the Bible in a year.
So yeah, I guess the first order of business is to kind of talk about why we even read First and Second Chronicles if it is a repeat of information we've already heard. So that's interesting in and of itself. Like as Westerners, as modern readers, we think reading is about accessing information and just getting data. But there's something different about the way that ancient readers read and compiled narratives and stories that make it important for us to understand why a book like First and Second Chronicles is in the Old Testament. So yeah, it tells history in a different way. It's like a different flyover of Israel's history.
Yeah, and it starts from Adam all the way to the return from the exile. So it covers a long span of time with like a good recap from a historical lens. That's a different voice from the author of First and Second Kings and First and Second Samuel. Yeah.
And I think we mentioned in the other podcast last week that the Hebrew Bible ends differently than our Christian Old Testament canon closes. So in the Hebrew Bible, the end of it is First and Second Chronicles. So First and Second Chronicles is the end of the Hebrew canon, whereas for us, we end it with the prophets. So just that's interesting in and of itself, that the way that the Hebrews would read, or the Jewish people would read First and Second Chronicles, was like a sort of closing with an invitation to hope, an invitation to look forward to the promise becoming real among them.
Yeah, and that promise being the Messiah primarily,
right.
and the building of the temple. And I mean, there is like a main actor in First Chronicles is David. I mean, it's pretty much a lot of it centers around David in the first part, First Chronicles, and then the second part goes to Solomon and the temple construction. But with that, you have a list of all types of people kind of being like anchor points, and going back all the way to Adam, to all the people who like established the kingdom, all the people who, there's like a lot of lists, genealogies. Right. So it's also like the community is also being highlighted, but there's definitely this anchor kingdom figure of David, and this waiting for the king, this messianic king to arrive.
Right.
Definitely like just the anchor throughout this entire narrative that recaps so much history.
Well, and I think just again, the fact that the Hebrew Bible ends with this book, whereas the Christian Old Testament puts it right after First and Second Kings, it is kind of like a strange PR move from the church. Like, well, because it seems like, again, like we just read this in First and Second Kings, and now we're going to read it again, but with a different angle.
Yeah, so the Protestant Bible ends with Malachi, right? And there's always the sermons you may hear that like someone like John the Baptist is going to return.
Right.
And I mean, someone like Elijah is going to return, who's John the Baptist. And here it's just focusing more on the Messiah and the new temple being established,
Right.
versus the prophet who inaugurates that sign.
Right. So maybe it would be helpful just to give readers a little bit of a clue on how to read First and Second Chronicles, so that it's not just boring literature to them, but they can kind of understand it.
I mean, the first 8 chapters of genealogy is not exciting for you, Jeremy?
Yeah, it's not really doing it for me. I think that's a good place to start. Like, what's the ancient use of a genealogy? Like, why did people care about who's who and who belonged to who? And it really comes down to, again, that promise narrative from the very beginning of the Bible, in the first book, in Genesis with Abraham. And the reason that genealogies exist is to connect people to those storylines, to say, like, this story we're about to tell is important because of that story back, hundreds, thousands of years back, right? So they're kind of like, I don't know, what would a modern example be? Kind of like hyperlinks, maybe. Like when you're reading something on Wikipedia and it hyperlinks something else, and you go down the rabbit hole of connecting one thing to the other to the other. In some ways, that's how genealogies function in the ancient world, to kind of link you to and connect you to older stories.
Yeah, I mean, it's also fascinating. Genealogies have kind of made a return with people taking DNA tests these days and figuring out where they come from. And a lot of like social sciences say like one of the biggest indicators for someone's like well-being is they have a strong sense of where they're from.
Right.
And I think it's beautiful that like it seems boring, but like it's awesome when you could really like trace where you're from, where you're part of the human history, where is your part in this story.
I mean, if you're Armenian and you're listening, this makes total sense. Like, we do this all the time. Are you Eintapsi? Are you Kharpetsi? Are you Urfartsi? Like,
especially because we're people who've been like wiped out. So like, I think it's, and you have to keep the context here. Like the Southern and Northern Kingdom gets destroyed. These books are written to make sure they're not this, like the Bible preserves the narrative through destruction, literally, and exile.
Right.
And I mean, the same thing with us as genocide survivors. But even before that, like if you read Moses Kordanatsi, like 5th century art historian that traces back Armenian history, he says like we're a small nation, but we have these stories to preserve. We get our butts kicked, but we still have mighty deeds to record and to testify to. And it like that was 1,500 years ago. Now it like seems like nothing has changed.
Right. And like there's a sense of pride culturally when we remind ourselves who we are and where we come from and to whom we belong. It's also just like we have, I mean, whether it's right or wrong is, we can leave that on the table, but we make assumptions about people based on where they're from, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you talk about Eintapsi, you talk about, well, I'm going to get in trouble here, but you talk about their cooking, right? You talk about all the
I'm one of those, so
yeah. Kharpetsis have one reputation, and Urfatsis have a different reputation. If you're Marashti, you have that reputation.
Exactly.
So like, we kind of trace our history back, but we also make sort of template assumptions about people based on where they come from.
Yeah, and even the tribes of Israel kind of are that, right? Like you have these 12 brothers, these 12 tribes that are established that kind of have a subculture to them. I was really fascinating. I was talking to a guy from a Pentecostal church that originated in, I think, Mali. It's just another pastor in Queens. I had an event. I just talked to him, and he was telling me how their governance structure is that each member of the church gets assigned one of the tribes of Israel. And each of the tribes represents a team to get the church functioning. So like the Levites are like the preachers and priests. There's like the tribe of Judah, I think, is the worship team. There's like a hospitality tribe. There's
so funny.
It's just fascinating, but they take ownership of their role to help the church community strive. It's a very fascinating church governance structure for membership, because I know every pastor who always struggles to get volunteers and teams established, but it really gives them an identity of like, this is my purpose. I got to do this for the church.
Right. And again, so full circle, that's the reason why genealogies are in the Bible. they give the reader and also the audience like a sense of belonging to a story and belonging to something that goes back deeper than their agency and their, you know, their own world and the current present, you know, situation. So it's a tracing back to a different time, but also looking forward to a different time.
Yeah, you have to look back to look forward properly. It's always the case.
Right. And yeah, and so I think, you know, if you know, I don't know that genealogies should be like read as devotional material, you know, but like I
mean, some people maybe read their like 23andMe's as devotional, like, oh wow.
That's true. So maybe that's an interesting thing too, is like, you know, we don't read, how do I say this? Not all literature is meant to be read the same way, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
when we read Genesis, we should read it differently than reading Chronicles, or when we read Song of Solomon, we should read it differently than we read, you know, the Gospels, you know. So if there's anything we want to encourage our readers to do, it's to read wisely and to read well what they're reading. So when you read a genealogy, don't expect to get like what you would out of the Gospel of John, right? But you will get something from the text by understanding that this is how the story begins. It's connecting you to these old histories. And, you know, frankly, each one of the people that are being mentioned has a backstory in the books that they're from. And so, you know, you could, if you want to read it well, you could go back and hear that story and then go back and plug it into the story that's being told in Chronicles.
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you how many like fascinating stories I have just from people finding out their genealogies, people finding out they have half siblings, people finding out like we've had probably like 3 or 4 Turks come to our church who said, I'm quarter Armenian, I didn't know. So it's just fascinating how that whole field is becoming a thing now, and what it's revealing and showing up. But yeah, absolutely, I think we read reports differently than we would read other things. I mean,
yeah, I mean, even like, I think we've talked about this in the podcast in the past, but I also work as a marriage and family therapist. And one of the things that we do from the very get-go is get a family of origin genealogy. We call it a genogram. And it's fascinating to see what happens to people when they see patterns that are going on within their family play out in the present. So really, it's even just something, it seems strange when you put it on paper and you're like, okay, this is just a retelling of how many people belong to how many people and whose family is from who. But even in modern times, I mean, it's a therapy intervention that's being used in family therapy.
Yeah, and I do the same thing when I do premarital counseling, the genograms. It's fascinating to see, like, it's a boring process at first. Then when they talk it out, they see the like, why is this a repeating pattern in my family?
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's another way you can read that opening line is what are the patterns that show up in the storyline of Israel, and how is it showing up here now in this book, First and Second Chronicles? So yeah, that's one way you can read Chronicles well. And the other way, I think, is the rest of the book is just, again, a rehashing of First and Second Kings and even First and Second Samuel, but with a sort of, I don't know, with an angle, a twist. Like it's, you know, David is looked at through rose-colored glasses. In First and Second Chronicles, you don't hear anything about Bathsheba. You don't hear anything about Absalom. You don't hear anything about him running in the wild, hiding from Saul. Like, David's just this like pristine figure in First and Second Chronicles. So that's troublesome. Maybe we should talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's important to know that, like, I don't know, it's kind of like a similar thing about like the founding fathers. It's like, wait, Thomas Jefferson owned slaves? George Washington owned slaves? Like, an interesting one that, I mean, we just recently celebrated MLK Day, but an interesting, sorry guys, my camera went out. But an interesting thing that's going to be coming up to the media is like the FBI is going to release some of the footages they have on MLK.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And like Martin Luther King, who's a hero of mine, I mean, he did commit adultery on his wife. And there's going to be some files being released that's going to be revealing the details of that in a couple of years. There's a great documentary, I think, on HBO. It's called FBI and MLK. And it's just fascinating to think about how like someone like him, there's going to be we don't tell the negative aspects of his story, and when we're going to teach kids,
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? There's like at some point the person's like what the person stood for becomes crystallized or becomes kind of put on a pedestal so that we kind of are willing to overlook some of the flaws. I mean, all of our heroes are flawed. I think just kind of a nerd point to make is that I think that's why we love all these Marvel movies so much, because they show flawed characters who are heroes who try to make it work. But that's just kind of a side note.
No, but I mean, that's why DC is not as popular.
That's right.
Except for Batman.
Right. That's right. That's right. So, like, it is interesting that, we come to a text that tells history differently. And I think that's hard for us as Westerners. Like, we like to think that history is this objective retelling of past events. And it seems like, especially to the ancient reader, there is no such thing as an objective retelling of past events. There's always some point to be made, and you arrange the history and the data accordingly so it makes that point. And here, I think in Chronicles, the point is somebody like David, somebody who represents what David stood for, needs to take over and make things right. And so that hope of a new David coming is more important to the chronicler, whoever, we don't want to get into who wrote it, but that is more important to the chronicler than David's missteps and mishaps and his flaws. He wants to make sure that the reader knows that we need somebody like a David figure to make things right and make things whole. And that frankly, I think is why the Hebrew Bible ends with Chronicles rather than slapping it in the middle at the end of the historical books.
Yeah, I remember taking a class on leadership in undergrad, and there was this discussion on who is like the best leader. And people brought up people in history, and like everyone brought up, there was that, like, I think this is such a millennial, like, it's part of this cancel culture too. It's like whenever someone was brought up, they would bring up a sour point that's not PC today.
Right.
Like, it doesn't undermine what they accomplished.
Right.
And I remember saying Jesus Christ, and just everyone ignored me because they didn't want to go there in the class.
It's really funny. I mean, it goes to the like, it's hard to draw the line between telling history with a purpose and then propaganda, right? Like, there is a sense in which people can misuse history. I mean, it's happening, right before our eyes right now, where people will connect the dots of history and make a point that's totally ridiculous and say that this is and use it as sort of a propaganda point. But there is a sense in which on a less dramatic scale, if every history is told for a point and a purpose. We tell the stories of Abraham Lincoln and his pushing to unite the Union after Civil War and Reconstruction and the end of slavery and all that. We tell those stories and we talk about Abraham Lincoln as being this figure in such a way that the ideal is held up, and that it has purpose and it drives us to do better, right? And I think the same for like Martin Luther King, right? We just celebrated Martin Luther King on yesterday. We're recording this Tuesday. It was on Monday. And yeah, he had his flaws. We tell history a certain way to make his ideal stand out as something that's important to us today, to generate new action. So
yeah,
it's a tough line to walk.
Yeah. I think it's important to know that everyone's has flaws to them.
Yeah.
And I think it's also, it's not just genealogies or demonizing people's baggages, but it's also, I think, part of the frustration in our culture today is people just don't appreciate history as much.
Right.
I think that's a problem, because I think like people always think that, all right, we can't relate to the people in the past. They lived in different times, but like the Spanish flu was 100 years ago. It wasn't that far. And we could have learned some lessons from that going into this pandemic. Or or other things of that nature. I think the saying that history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. I think Mark Twain gets attributed to that quote, but we don't really know who said that. But like, there's something to that. There's this rhythmic patterns to human civilizations and histories, and to think that there's something to learn from a civilization 3,000 years ago, I think is arrogant.
Yeah. You know, I'm just having this thought that as we talk about Chronicles, it reminds me of like, I don't know. It's like, it reminds me of Hamilton. It's like, it's a retelling of an old story, but in a way that makes sense for a new generation.
Yeah.
And so, you know, like, we didn't think of Hamilton as, you know, this immigrant upstart who like pushed his way up to the top and made it work. And yet, you know, somebody had the creative mind to connect those dots and tell the story in that way, and it became powerful for. I mean, it was a whole phenomenon.
and he had his affair that to make him president.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
So I think that a helpful kind of template for understanding Chronicles is, ironically, Hamilton. It's like, this is a story that's old and ancient. Here's the history, but we're telling it in a way where David is a hero, where the temple is coming, and where we're all connected to this history in the past, leading us to some sort of future. And it's being told to an exile community who's coming back from being separated from the land for so long, and they need to hear that message. And so it's important for them to hear it in this way. And it's not deceptive, it's not propaganda, it's just a telling of the story in a way that connects them to what needs to be told.
Yeah. And then through the Christian lens, like, you have new kings that emerge, new leaders that emerge, you have a new temple that emerges, but it's still lacking that promise of grandiose until Christ comes on the scene. He's the new Messiah, fulfills the promises, and he's the temple is his body. Like, that's why Jesus gets in trouble. People forget this. Like, he talks a lot about the temple and how in 3 days he's going to destroy it, and 3 days he'll lift it up.
That's how he gets crucified. That's the charge that sticks.
That's the charge, yeah.
At least with the Jewish community, and then he's a rebel when it comes to Rome. But yeah, exactly. That's the point that sticks. He gets in trouble over the temple.
And I love like the accounts of Jesus's genealogy too, having a messiness to them. There's Rahab. There's is Ruth connected to the genealogy? Yeah. So you have,
because she's connected to David.
So she's connected to David, exactly. So there's this messiness within David's genealogy and Jesus's genealogies, because it's messiness to everyone. Like, there's no one here who's listening that doesn't have some messy genealogy to them.
Right. And a side note, in Jesus's genealogy, there's women.
Yeah.
Which is not a typical thing in ancient genealogies. Women are overlooked, and so it's
right.
And they're strong women. They're leading roles. You know, you've got Rahab, you've got Ruth. You know, these are powerful women of their day.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, it's interesting. I think we may have almost succeeded at making First and Second Chronicles kind of cool.
It is cool, guys. Everyone's cool. And then there's like a list of the musicians and the warriors, and there's it's also like an indicator that like there was a whole community behind these stories too. It wasn't just David, you know. Like, I kind of like that aspect whenever there's a history behind someone and a community while they're doing their things that make them famous surrounding them. I think that's always important to keep in mind too.
Right. Well, we overlook this, but you know, we don't have to go too into depth, but there's a lot of worship-ish stuff in Chronicles because they're talking about the temple. So there's a lot of like detail about how worship should be conducted and what kind of music when, and you know, the kinds of things that should be in the temple. And so, you know, people who are interested in Israel's ancient worship often go to Chronicles to get some of that stuff.
Yeah, and this is also like the bigger theme too of why it's important to know the history of the Israelites, because like the early church heresy was Marcionism, and they pretty much said like, all right, we don't need the Old Testament. Let's just get rid of the Old Testament. But we can't understand the Messiah apart from the Old Testament.
Right.
Like, as Karl Barth said, if we get rid of the Old Testament, we're cutting the branch that we're standing on.
Yeah.
And that's why this stuff is important, because like, I think a lot of the dangers we run into with people interpreting the New Testament is they read it through the lens of like Plato and the Western world versus the Hebrew world. And when you read it through the Hebrew lens, then like everything Jesus accomplishes makes so much more sense. Right. And that's why we have to know the narrative, know where he's coming from, know the customs and practices, know the promises in that cultural setting.
Right.
And Chronicles plays a huge role in that, because it chronicles from Adam to the exile return. Like, it's a pretty big deal.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I don't know, I guess if we take the old Hebrew way of arranging the Bible and it ends with Chronicles, in some ways you should read Chronicles as a first preview intro into the New Testament. You know, like you watch these Netflix shows and they're always like, previously on such.
Yeah, I totally forgot what happened in season 1. Give me that 2-minute condensed.
So that's Chronicles. You should read Chronicles before you get to the Gospels, and it gives you a little hint and clue.
Yeah, previously in the Old Testament.
Yeah, exactly.
There was Adam, then there was this other guy.
That really like highlights the themes of the New Testament, you know?
We're still waiting for the king.
Right, waiting for the king, returning from exile, and looking for the temple of God's presence to show back up. And boom, right there. The kingdom of God is at hand.
Repent and be baptized and believe.
That's the first thing Jesus does in the Gospel of Mark.
The king is here, mic drop. Let's get to work. Let's see what that looks like.
So
I don't think we should.
We made our best case for 1st and 2nd Chronicles.
Yeah, I think we should stop right now before we bore our audience with random number accounts of how many trumpeters were in the temple in a certain period of time. But yeah, that's 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But I like that whole. I like ending it, the Old Testament, with this note. I think that there's something powerful to that.
Yeah. I think there's even an argument grammatically that Chronicles ends on an incomplete sentence.
Yeah.
That it ends with like what do you call it? The word "and." It's an appositive, I think. I can't remember the word of it, but it ends basically with like "and," like ellipsis.
The king will return in the New Testament. Dot. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's I think that makes a strong argument for reading it leading up to the New Testament.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Jeremy, thank you for this conversation. Like always, if no one listens, this helps with my sermons down the line, and also for my spiritual growth. It's always great to process the scriptures out loud with someone. I think this is how the Bible should be read, with community, with someone else.
Right.
And in these discussions, the beauty of the scriptures gets revealed.
Yeah.
Thank you all for listening. Don't just take our words for it. Read the good word yourself. Pick up 1st and 2nd Chronicles. If you like listening on an audio book version of it, go for it. Just read it. That's always one of our main motives behind this whole thing, is just for you guys to read the scriptures for yourselves. Thanks for listening, and God bless you, and take care.